It's an honor to join you today. Thank you for being here. I'm calling in from Ottawa on the original unceded territory of the Algonquin people. They have been the guardians of this land for millennia, and I'm grateful for their stewardship and their leadership. So let me begin by looking at this whole big theme of healthy public policy and what it means. So this first slide you can read for yourself, but the bolder things are to say that healthy public policy is about health and equity in all areas of policy, not just health policy, everything, transportation, housing, all of the other policy areas, and by an accountability for health impact. The main aim is to create supportive social and physical environments. Those are words that came from the Ottawa Charter, which Irv mentioned, and the Adelaide Statement, which the WHO Adelaide Statement, which followed 2 years later. 10 years after the Charter, the Canadian Public Health Association released a statement on healthy public policy as well. And they added, I think, some really important things, which is a focus on healthy living conditions, reducing disparities, supporting Indigenous rights, ensuring that economic activity is environmentally and socially sustainable, and lastly, ensuring the voices of society's least powerful, ensuring they are heard. But this is one of my mentors, ultimately, what can we do in terms of healthy public policy? We need to collaborate, we need to learn more, we need to use our expertise. But in the words of Nelson Mandela, ultimately, where you stand depends on where you sit. When I was working at the WHO back in 2002, we worked on a policy document about aging, about healthy aging. At that time, we were calling it active aging. It's now called healthy aging, and you could just replace that thing in the middle. What I wanted to say here is two important things, is that right from the get-go, we knew that it was a determinants, a health perspective that we needed to take in this circle. And secondly, we knew that there needed to be a gender lens and a cultural lens applied in terms of all public policies. So this is old, but you know what? I think it's still relevant. I wanted to say, just in introducing this area, how important words and images are. And Sherry will speak more about from weakness to resilience and how we need to change the narrative and the words. But I wanted to say something about what we determined very early on when we were just scoping out the book, and that was language. And this, I'm talking here English. We could have a whole nother discussion about this in French, and I'm sorry we can't do that today, and this might be hard for the interpreter. But certainly in English, in policy, there are a couple of red flags. One of them is elderly and elders, which is commonly used. Elderly has become a very stereotypical word that is associated with disease and frailty and burden. And so we would strongly urge people not to use that term. The second thing, and this is particularly critical in Canada, is that our Indigenous population has a very strong word called the elders with a capital E, and it is designated to people in the Indigenous community who are leaders in terms of sharing wisdom. So out of respect for that, and the fact that the word elderly has become so stereotypical, we would encourage you, when you're thinking about developing policies and practices and programs, to really think about using and how you use that word. In the book, we determined that we would talk about older persons, older people, older adults, and those are the preferred terms in English. We do acknowledge, however, that in Canada in particular, we have to talk about seniors, because seniors is defined as 65 plus. And this is in the legislation, this is in surveys, Statistics Canada, etc. So Although a lot of older people don't like the term seniors, we have to acknowledge that that is part of the research, and it has to be used appropriately in that way. My second point here is about ageist and power relationship language in policy statements, legislation, particularly guidelines, particularly in the healthcare sector. And we really need to take a close look at that. One of the underlying themes that came out in the book came out in multiple chapters is our need to establish a rights-based approach in terms of policy. And for those of you here from Canada, I don't need to say how much the example we've seen in long-term care as an example of an abuse of the human rights of older people. Recognizing it is a delicate balance, an individual's human rights, freedoms, and autonomy, and demands to protect the vulnerable and excluded. And I'd like to mention here that this isn't just Canada. This is an international move towards a rights-based approach in terms of looking at older people. And I know we have some people here from other countries, and I know that they would support that. The picture here is Margaret Gillis, who's one of our contributors, one of our writers in the book. And she is the president of the Longevity Center for Canada. And she writes about the need for a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, and that in fact, Canada can play a leadership role in making this happen. So I would hope that all of you would look at that and support this. So when you look at the whole book, some key policy issues, and they're not all here, but let me just mention a couple. The first one and the last one I'll deal with a bit more in detail. The second one, the longevity revolution. 85 plus is still a small percent of the population, but it's the fastest growing of all our population groups. And the 100-year life is ahead of us. It's now, and it's ahead of us. Are we ready for that? And this longevity revolution and the very old have major implications for policy around caregiving, around dementia, which is largely related to older age, and to long-term care. Also related to that, and to the fact that the baby boomers are big in number. And I believe, and we've seen, that the whole issue of dying, normalizing dying as a part of aging, medically assisted dying, and palliative care, dignified end-of-life care. Those are biggies. To counter that, we've got aging in place and in community. We know that over 90% of people want to stay out of long-term care as long as possible. It's not always possible, but how can a policy support people to age in place and in community? One of the other key themes we saw is the importance of lifelong learning, and in particular, health and digital literacy, breaking down that gap, that divide. We saw more emphasis on health promotion approaches to physical activity, healthy eating, and substance use. And what I mean there in terms of health promotion is more enabling approaches. And we have some good examples of promising practices, like the deprescribing practice. So, there's a real need to go back to not blaming people and not just focusing on lifestyle, but focusing on those environments that can enable. We've got to look at the learnings from COVID-19, which one of our writers calls the Gero pandemic. And, what did we learn from that as we're going forward? We need to address climate change effects on older people. In Canada, the most obvious was the heat dome tragedy we had in BC this last summer. I personally would add the whole issue of winter cities and changing climates there. I had a fall in the ice, and a concussion last year, which dramatically changed my life. And lastly, age tech. First, because we're talking about equity, diversity, and intersectionality, I'll let you read this for yourself, but to point out that there are health inequalities among older people in Indigenous communities, gender diverse communities, visible minority and immigrant communities, and those living with functional limitations. And that, as you all know, the intersectionality of these factors, because what our friend Gloria Gutman always says, there's diversity within diversity. And when you have this intersectionality, you're facing double or triple the risk of health inequalities. The other thing I'd like to say about diversity is that certainly in terms of the Canadian population, an older population, far more diverse than we were dealing with in the past. And that has to be a major part of public policy. I mentioned high tech, high touch. Let me just end with this. The opportunities in age tech, from communications technology to fall alert systems, to smart homes, to robotics, the opportunities here and the importance of this to healthy public policy is enormous. At the same time, we really need to balance this with high touch. And particularly during the pandemic, we've heard about, we know the research, the increase in socialization, loneliness, and depression in older people. I had one esteemed friend, researcher, geriatrician, say to me, people in long-term care, old people in long-term care are dying of loneliness and neglect more than they're dying of COVID. I've had nurses talk to me about their concern about this. And because I work in the area of grandparenting, I've had multiple grandparents talk to me about, and grandchildren talk to me about how terrible it has been to not be able to hug and be with that other generation. So that's just a very broad overview, and I'll turn it on to Jim now. Thanks.